Welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Nelson Weiss, President of the City Club. Today we are pleased, Today we are pleased to have as our speaker the Honorable Charles Mathias, Republican Senator from the state of Maryland. Particularly pleased to have Senator Mathias with us here today after, as you can well imagine, exhaustive sessions in the Senate, all-night sessions, and are most appreciative of his putting us on his schedule as well and making sure that he got here today, which we're very appreciative of. Senator Mathias is a man of many facets, but he comes to us today in particular as a champion of and an acknowledged expert on free speech, civil liberties, and the United States Constitution. His talk today coincides with our club's annual Free Speech Forum, made possible by a generous memorial fund established by the family of Dr. Samuel O. Friedlander, president of the City Club 20 years ago, 1962. We're pleased to have Mrs. Friedlander and other members of Dr. Friedlander's family with us today, and they're seated at our head table. Thank you so much. Senator Mathias is chairman of the Senate Rules Committee and is a ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He serves on the Foreign Relations Committee and chairs its subcommittee on international economic policy. He's a native of Frederick, Maryland, attended Haverford College, and received his law degree from the University of Maryland. His past positions include service in the United States House of Representatives and the Maryland House of Delegates. He's been a member of the United States Senate since his election in 1968 and his re-election in 1974 and again in 1980. Among the senator's greatest concerns, however, are the defense of civil liberties and retaining the integrity of the United States Constitution. Accordingly, he speaks to us today on the subject, Born Secret, New Challenge to the First Amendment. Senator Mathias.
Well, thank you very much, President Weiss, Mrs. Friedlander, members of the City Club, and ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me thank you for asking me to return to the City Club. It's been some years since I was last here, and it's always a great pleasure to be here. I am intrigued by the subject of this meeting, and I think that it's one that is timely, and I'd like to discuss with you just a little bit how timely it is. The First Amendment to the Constitution is Exhibit A for the proposition that a statement of principles need not be long in order to be powerful. Just think what a treasure trove of our national ideals is packed into 45 words. The words of the First Amendment which resonate in the American imagination. They conjure up to me the scenes of the battlegrounds where the historic struggle for freedom of thought and freedom of expression has been waged. When we think of the First Amendment, we sometimes think of the public streets and parks with soapbox orators and with demonstrators petitioning the government for a redress of grievances. Or we think of the front pages of daily newspapers, free to print the truth as they see it on the issues of the day. Or we think of the courtrooms of the nation, where judges must sometimes struggle to accommodate the conflicting interests of a free press and a fair trial. I think all of these First Amendment battlegrounds are familiar, but one of the most intriguing First Amendment dramas of our own time is being enacted now on a much less public and I think a much less publicized stage. The curtain is rising on a production which may never be a Broadway hit. The cast doesn't have any stars, and major portions of the script are written in a language that's almost unintelligible to all but, I suppose, a handful of the audience. But the outcome of this curious drama will be of very great importance to all of us who care about the First Amendment. Let me set the scene in San Diego, California. The time, August of this year. The 28th Annual Technical Symposium of the Society of Photo-Optical Instrumentation Engineers is set to open. 2,700 scientists from 25 countries are converging on San Diego to hear some 700 scientific papers presented and to share insights and experience and information with their colleagues in this very arcane field of research and technology. Suddenly, a telegram is delivered to the conference headquarters. It's from the United States Department of Commerce, and it warns the conference that the symposium may be in violation of federal law because federal export control regulations might, just might, apply to many of the papers that are scheduled for presentation. So the participants' research in holography, in fiber optics, in lasers, and in other fields may qualify as technical data under the regulations. And even though the meeting is taking place within the United States, if any foreigners happen to be in the audience when the papers are read, that communication might constitute an export in the eyes of the law. And the technical symposium would therefore need to obtain an export license for each such paper. Now, the conference organizers, as the scene unfolds, are dumbfounded. They don't know what to make of it. Before they have time to consider a response, there's an eminent scientist bursting into the room, and he has received an urgent telephone message from a research office at the Pentagon. The Defense Department has provided some grants from support for his research in microelectronics. None of the research is classified. None of it directly involves weapons development. But some of the work the Pentagon feels, thinks, supposes, has potential application to weapon systems that may be a few years down the road. And the Pentagon officials have told the scientist that the paper he is about to present has to be cleared in advance, and failure to clear it may constitute illegal export. Now, the scientist has barely finished speaking when another one arrives, has the same story, and then another, and then another. Submit your paper for pre-clearance or face the consequences. So the scientists panic. The conference agenda collapses. Many participants feel sure that the delivery of their papers would have no impact on national security, but they pull back their papers anyway. As one of them puts it, when you work for the Defense Department or a defense contractor, their wish is your command. Some of the members of the society resign, afraid that the society is on the Pentagon hit list. In all, 150 of the papers are withdrawn. And as the curtain falls on this sad scene, a reporter from Science magazine is filing her story. The symposium is a shambles. Well, the chaotic demise of the San Diego conference appears, I think, at first glance to have very little in common with the other more familiar First Amendment battles. But I think on reflection, we can see that it presents a classic First Amendment problem of prior restraint. That is, the government tried to restrict speech before it happened. The conference organizers weren't told that the symposium couldn't go on, and the participants weren't told that they couldn't deliver the papers. But they were all told in no uncertain terms that whatever was said would have to be approved in advance by the government. Now, the threat of censorship, I think, was very clearly implied. If the government decided that a speech was dangerous, it would be suppressed. And the response to the government's threat of prior restraint was also a textbook case. And so the frightened scientists withdrew their papers without waiting to find out whether or not the government would approve their delivery. So in other words, the government had what the courts have called a chilling effect on the scientist's speech. I think this incident treads familiar First Amendment ground in another sense. It was a classic confrontation between freedom of expression and national security. What concerned the government most was the presence of foreign scientists, particularly, of course, those from the Soviet bloc. The Export Administration regulations are designed to prevent sensitive high technology from falling into Soviet hands. And although none of this research was classified, the Commerce and the Defense Departments evidently decided that national security considerations justified this threat of the suppression of free speech. Now, this tension between the right to speak and the responsibility to protect national security goes back, of course, to the earliest days of the Republic. The melodrama that I have sketched for you, the melodrama of the photo-optical instrumentation engineers, I think epitomizes a new trend. With increasing frequency, the government is trying to post some fields of scientific inquiry as being off limits. It's declaring that discussion of certain kinds of technical information is dangerous. And so it's slapping restrictions on discussions of them and on publications about them. In some of the chilling cases, this so-called dangerous information is really material that's in the public domain. It's not something that's pilfered from government files or that is improperly leaked to unauthorized persons. It may never even have ever been in the possession of the government. But the government has taken the position that some information which results from research and study by private individuals is too dangerous to see the light of day. And the fruit of creative activity must be pushed back out of sight by the heavy hand of the censor. This is information which is, in a word, born secret. Let's just look at a few more scenes in this drama. One encounter that was played out under the bright lights on center stage was the case of the United States of America versus the Progressive. In February of 1979, the editors of the Progressive magazine sent the Department of Energy a copy of an article that they planned to publish in the next issue. It was entitled "The H-Bomb Secret." How we got it, why we're telling it. A pretty arresting title, I must say. But the article was based entirely on unclassified data, data that was already in the public domain, which had been pieced together by an enterprising freelance writer with no particular scientific background. The government, on reading this text, immediately asked the Progressive not to publish the article because the government asserted that it contained secret technical data about the construction of the hydrogen bomb. Now, the Progressive refused, and so the government went to court to get an injunction against publication. The United States argued that the information in the article was, to use the term again, born secret, even if it came entirely from publicly available sources. It was too dangerous to the national security to permit publication. And the United States District Court agreed, and for the first time, the very first time in the 190-year history of the federal courts, it ordered a prior restraint on publication on the grounds of national security. So the concept of dangerous information had made a judicial debut and made it with a bang. Now, the next scene is more private. In fact, the National Security Agency in my state of Maryland, which plays a major role, is one of the most secret agencies in the entire government. One, incidentally, for which I have great respect and appreciation. But it is so secret that even the presidential memorandum which established NSA has never been made public. And one of NSA's jobs is to devise codes for secret government communications and to break the codes of other governments. Naturally, the agency is very interested in cryptography, the science of making codes and breaking codes. And of course, research in that field has a number of other applications. For example, cryptography can help banks and other corporations and other government agencies, for that matter, to safeguard information in computer memory. And since that information nowadays includes sensitive personal and financial data on every one of us, sensitive as to how much we have, or perhaps in some cases how little we have, but cryptography research is really vital to the protection of personal privacy. About 5 years ago, a few NSA officials began to express the view that all research in the field of cryptography should be under its control. And that could mean the end of unclassified cryptographic research, which didn't sit very well with some cryptographers. And the result was an extraordinary dialogue between NSA and the scientists. NSA suggested that all papers in the field of cryptography be submitted to it for pre-publication review. The cryptographers rejected the idea of mandatory prior restraint. But earlier this year, they did agree to a voluntary system in which authors will have the option to submit their papers to NSA. Now, some of the dissenters denounced the system as the first step towards government censorship of scientific research. And this is a controversy. This is a scene on which the curtain has not yet rung down. The dispute goes on. Sometimes the scenes in this unfolding drama of the restriction of scientific communication seem to come from the theater of the absurd. For example, the State Department asked several American universities to prevent a visiting Chinese computer expert from touring any industrial facilities or having any access to unclassified research funded by the Pentagon. One university wrote back to ask if the government really wanted the university to keep the visiting scholar out of the library and to confine him only to the student union. Well, I could give other examples, but I think the trend is clear, that the threat to the free flow of scientific communication is real and that it's growing. And this trend poses problems for the First Amendment that are really unlike any of the problems that we have heretofore faced in our nation's history. To come to grips with the problem, I think we first have to resolve two questions. One has to do with our perceptions, and the other with our actions. The first question might be this, that is scientific communication really the sort of speech that the First Amendment declares to be free? In some respects, the incidents that I've described really don't fit the pattern that comes to our mind when we think of the First Amendment. We know that the amendment protects the soapbox orator in the public park. That's clear. Every American would recognize that. But what about the physicist who comes to a symposium to share the results of his research with a tiny audience, who may be the only people in the world who fully understand what he's talking about? We know that the amendment protects the publisher of a newspaper. But what about the author of a highly technical article in an obscure scientific journal? We know that wherever Americans gather in this country to discuss personal beliefs or political questions or world affairs, that the First Amendment will follow them in the door. It shelters these discussions, and it fences interference from the government out. So the question is, should it be any different when the discussion is about lasers rather than about laws, or about protons rather than about principles? I don't think these questions have very easy answers. By and large, the courts haven't addressed them, and legal scholars are only now beginning to talk about them. But events may force us to resolve them sooner rather than later. And to answer these questions, we have to examine the values that lie at the core of the First Amendment. When we do that, I think we will conclude that that scientific speech ought to receive the full protection of the First Amendment. The free flow of information and of ideas is one of the most important values that's served by the First Amendment. I think it's indispensable to social progress. It's essential to our system of self-government. The drafters of the First Amendment were well aware that freedom of communication is a crucial distinguishing factor between a republic and a dictatorship. James Madison observed that knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. Today, as a society, we have armed ourselves with that power. We've armed ourselves with that power to a degree unprecedented in the history of the world. And much of the knowledge that enables people to be their own governors is scientific knowledge. Increasingly, our most urgent public policy decisions depend on scientific information, and the progress of science depends on freedom of communication, freedom of speech. One of the popular images of the scientist is of a solitary genius, toiling for decades in the seclusion of the laboratory to unlock a hidden mystery of the natural world. And that image is probably not entirely wrong. Like other creative work, scientific research sometimes requires solitude, meditation. But science also requires communication. Data must be published and then analyzed and criticized by others in the field. Experimental results have to be publicized if they're to be replicated, duplicated. The solitary genius is just a part of the picture. As one philosopher of science has written, scientific achievements are a part of a single edifice that is collectively assembled by scientists. The scientist, when you get down to it, is really not so different from the soapbox orator of the more familiar realms of First Amendment law. The scientist uses speech to try to convince his audience, usually fellow scientists, of the validity of his point of view. That's why one scientist writes that a good experiment is a powerful piece of rhetoric. It has the ability to persuade the most obdurate and skeptical mind to accept a new idea. Perhaps the words of Albert Einstein sum it up. The progress of science presupposes the possibility of unrestricted communication of all results and judgments, freedom of expression in all realms of intellectual endeavor. To put it another way, I read Einstein as saying, in effect, that science needs the First Amendment. Freedom of speech goes a long way toward explaining why the United States is the world's preeminent scientific power. It is no coincidence that science has flourished in a nation that is so dedicated to an essential principle of scientific progress that we have actually incorporated it into our Constitution. That is why we should be very leery of the idea that national security demands that we cut back on First Amendment protection for scientific communication. Our own experience suggests that such a policy would be counterproductive. The National Academy of Sciences recently convened a panel on scientific communication and national security to study this problem, and it concluded that the economic and military strength of the United States is based to a substantial degree upon its superior achievements in science and technology. Controls on scientific communication can be seen to weaken both military and economic capacities by restricting the mutually beneficial interaction of scientific investigators. Now that brings me briefly and finally to the second question, the question of actions. What can be done to bring First Amendment principles to bear on the suppression of scientific communication? And that is not an easy answer either. The power of the executive branch of our government over national security matters is extremely broad. When a national security issue is raised, the other branches of government, as I can testify, are very reluctant to intervene. Potter Stewart, a distinguished Supreme Court justice, summed up the problem in the 1971 Pentagon Papers case, which was the government's first attempt in modern history to justify a prior restraint on publication on national security grounds. The majority of the court wouldn't buy it, and Justice Stewart agreed with the majority, but he added these valuable comments. In the governmental structure created by our Constitution, the executive is endowed with enormous power in the two related areas of national defense and international relations. In the absence of the governmental checks and balances present in other areas of national life, the only effective restraint upon executive policy and power in these areas may lie in an enlightened citizenry, in an informed and critical public opinion, which alone can here protect the values of democratic government. With the perspective of almost a dozen years since the decision in the Pentagon Papers case, perhaps Justice Stewart was just a little too pessimistic, because there are several things that the Congress can do to illuminate the problems raised by the recent executive branch actions. First, the administration has claimed that legal authority for its actions derives from two sets of export regulations that have been promulgated. One of the statutes which underlies these regulations, the Export Administration Act, is up for renewal next year. This will allow Congress to examine how these statutes have been applied in recent years and to explore whether any changes are needed to protect the freedom of scientific communication. Second, the statutory basis for some of the administration's actions ought to be clarified. For example, President Reagan recently issued a new executive order on national security information. Like his predecessors, the president relied on very general implied powers without referring to any particular law. The fact that much of the security classification system that has been so pervasive in our government for decades has never been explicitly authorized by the Congress, and we ought to consider whether that state of affairs should continue indefinitely. Finally, the Congress can help to develop that informed and critical public opinion that Justice Stewart knew was so important. Woodrow Wilson once wrote that it is the proper duty of a representative body to look diligently into every affair of government and to talk much about what it sees. The restriction of scientific communication is an area that would bear some diligent looking and some informed talking on the part of the Congress. The government's attempts to restrict scientific communication are, at least to me, troubling. But I think that so far they've done very little damage. But they do pose a challenge to the First Amendment, which we ignore at our peril. If it is true, as Jefferson once said, that the ground of liberty must be gained by inches, then I suppose it could be lost in the same way, inch by inch. Our dedication to the First Amendment must be as broad as it is deep. Our vision of the First Amendment must be as far-reaching as the expression whose freedom it protects. And that vision must extend to the library and to the laboratory, as well as to the public park and to the printing press. And if that vision is to prevail, it must be embraced and sustained, not only in the halls of Congress and in this citadel of free speech, but by all who mean to be their own governors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Senator Mathias. Today at the City Club, we're listening to Senator Charles Mathias of Maryland addressing us on the subjects of free speech and the First Amendment. In just a moment, we'll turn to our traditional question period. Right now, some announcements. A reminder again that as we come to the end of another year, now is the right time to consider a tax-deductible donation to our Forum Foundation. It's gifts of this sort that enable us to present the high quality of forums each week that we do, as this forum today so exemplifies so perfectly. Mail your check to the Forum Foundation, care of the City Club, 850 Euclid Avenue. Note our new address. I'll applaud to that one also, 850 Euclid Avenue. A very, very exciting new facility, and we will be there momentarily. Each gift will be promptly and appreciatively acknowledged. Don't forget your tax-deductible donation to the Forum Foundation. Today, as always, we have students with us from area high schools who are participating in our Living Seminars program, which we sponsor in cooperation with the Cleveland Public Schools and Cuyahoga Community College. With us now are students from the following high schools: Collinwood, East High School, Jane Addams, Berea, Independence, Shaw, Bay, and St. Joseph Academy. Will they stand, please, to receive our welcome? Thank you. They'll be meeting with Senator Mathias for their own seminar right after our forum here. Next week, there will be no regularly scheduled forum because of the Christmas holiday, but you may tune in to WCLV and the other stations on our radio network at the usual times to hear the special forum address given earlier this month by Colonel Robert Overmyer, the astronaut who piloted the Columbia Space Shuttle, which was a City Club forum that has not previously been broadcast. Remember, that's next week. Then on New Year's weekend, again, we have no forum here, but we shall rebroadcast the forum program first presented as a holiday treat 2 years ago, featuring Shakespearean actor Vincent Dowling playing the part of the legendary Mr. Dooley of the 1900s. Keep in mind then, 2 weeks from today, at our regular time on WCLV, Vincent Dowling's forum address as Mr. Dooley. Then on January 7th, we'll pick up again on our regular forum schedule, meeting right here at the Hollenden, which should be the last forum to be held here at the Hollenden House, who've been very, very kind to us, but we're also very anxious to move on, and that should be the last one. Now for our questions for Senator Mathias. We have 2 microphones. one over here with Alan Davis, and here with Bob Conrad. Please raise your hand to be recognized. The first question, please. Senator?
You have scared the hell out of me, Senator. With your recitations. What I want to know is how soon will a fascist state engulf us?
Well, I have a great deal of confidence in the Constitution of the United States, which will prevent that as long as the people of the United States are vigilant. You pay me too much. You give me too much credit to say that I scared you, but I hope I alerted you to the fact that there is an issue here which needs the attention of a broadly informed public. And I think if we are aware that a trend has set in that needs to be examined by the public and some careful value judgments made, it will not go too far. It'll stop far short of a communist, of a fascist state. But if we were to allow it to drift, and if this prior restraint on publication should become a habit on the part of the government, then, of course, the ability to contest the drift would be very much weakened. So if I hope I didn't scare you, but if I got your attention, why, I think the trip has been worthwhile. And I got your attention, I hope, by better means than Mr. Dooley will tell you about. When you remember Mr. Dooley once said that the only way to deal with a congressman is to hit him in the snout. And I hope I've stopped short of that.
Senator, what is your opinion of writers or people who have blown the covers of our spies by publishing names, and also of disgruntled people who have left the security agencies and then start writing about it? Should they be protected?
I think, obviously, people who disclose the names and addresses of security agents, officials of the Central Intelligence Agency, for example, and thereby endanger their lives, are despicable. I think they are among the lowest form of human life. And my outrage at their actions is, I think, exceeded by no one else. I think they're absolutely outrageous. But I am not convinced that all of society should be restricted by prior restraint on publication. I think these people violate the law, and they should bear the full burden of the law for having transgressed the law. Now, as far as people who have been in the CIA or other agencies and then publish, I think their behavior is equally reprehensible. And of course, they have not only violated the law, they violated their given word, their sworn word, because I had in my hands just the other day the form of contract that those people sign before they come into the government, in which they pledge themselves solemnly not to publish that. And how they can look themselves in the mirror, I do not see. So I'm ready to lower the boom on them, but not prior restraint.
Senator, can you help us to understand a problem relating to the Congress in connection with Social Security? The President appears to have passed the buck to the Commission, and in turn, Senator Dole has said that he's waiting for leadership from the President.
Number one, I think the American people should feel reassured that the government is not going to let the Social Security system go bankrupt. The Social Security system is a participatory institution in which all of us, as we are workers and earners, participate by paying in, and when we become retired, we participate by drawing some benefits. So we don't own a bank account. It's not an S&L account or a savings account. It's a right to participate in whatever's there. And we have to make sure that an adequate amount is there to take care of the needs of elderly Americans. The problem really is, it doesn't originate with Ronald Reagan or with Bob Dole or with any one person. The problem originates with the fact that the American people have changed in what they officially call the demographic profile. They've changed in the ratio of workers to retired. And we ought to all be celebrating this. We ought to be saying that's the greatest news you ever heard of, because what it means is that we're living longer than any other generation of Americans had ever lived. This is the gift that American medicine and American diet and American living conditions have given to the American people. We have more older people because we're living longer. That's something to celebrate. Now there's a little problem connected with it. How do you pay the bill for those extra years? And that's not beyond our ingenuity to figure out. What we have to do is look at the period of Franklin Roosevelt in which the system was predicated, in which there was a certain ratio of workers to retirees. Figure that the conditions have changed, the actuarial base has changed, and we have to adjust the actuarial base just as the way an insurance company would adjust it on a life insurance or a health and accident policy. And that's really what it takes. It's no political mystery or magic about it. We need a few actuaries. And I think we'll have them in, and then we'll be able to make the choices. And the choices are pretty simple, and I think they ought to be understood by the American people, not in a panic scene, but just in a clear, objective way. The choices are, do you raise the taxes, or do you lower the benefits, or do you do a little of each, and what's going to suit most people? And it's a pretty practical, down-to-earth decision. I think the Congress will get to it if we have the guts. We'll get to it in the next Congress, somewhere in the next 12 to 18 months, and I think we should have the guts to do it. The problem really doesn't threaten us today. I would just utter this one word of warning, that the real problem in Social Security comes along about the year 2005, because that's when the World War II baby boom matures to the 65 age bracket. And as you get that bulge in your elderly population, 2005, 2010, that general period of history, then there will be a real crisis in Social Security unless we make the relatively small actuarial adjustments today to plan for that future. But here again, there's nothing to be frightened or panicked about. It's all there. These people exist. Those babies were born back in the 40s and 50s. They're alive. You can count them. You know exactly when they're going to hit the 65th birthday. So we can plan ahead and take care of it. But we've got to go ahead and do it.
Senator, first my compliments. To scare the hell out of Peter de Leon is something the good Lord has not been able to achieve. I do have a question. I was talking yesterday to an electronic engineer, and I asked him, what does he see as the next cloud on the horizon to follow the digital and the computer? And he said it will be the dense massing of information on an electronic chip. And we are going to be hit by an avalanche of data that is going to overwhelm us. If this is the case, and if we pick people to analyze what data we should see or not see, I ask you about the Greek warning, who shall guard the guards themselves?
Well, I think this is one of the problems that this wonderful age in which we live presents us. And I once was a lawyer. My father said if I had stayed in the office, I might have ended up as a good lawyer. But I find that as a former lawyer, that one of the most exciting things about this age is that we are applying these philosophical principles that we have inherited from the past. Principles that are enshrined in the Constitution, but whose roots go back into English history and further into ancient history. That we apply these principles to the wonders of technology that are exploding all around us. Just this Monday and Tuesday, I attended a meeting in Paris on the impact of cable television on copyright. And that is a major impact, and it's going to involve billions of dollars of losses to the United States if we don't have adequate copyright protection on this new technology of cable transmission of video and audio. And I think the massing of information on chips is another just example of how you're going to deal with this new technology. How are you going to protect the right of intellectual property that is represented by copyright and patent? And it's not going to be easy because you've got a lot of pulling and hauling among individuals and among different parts of the world, the developed world and the developing world. But I find it a challenge to try to take these basic and essential principles of government and to try to apply them to the space age technology that we are developing. And I don't maintain that we'll get through it without some scars and without some cost, but it will be a remarkable world when we finally get there.
Senator, you spoke of how the claim of national security can affect the scientific community. Would you comment on President Reagan's recent statement that advocates of nuclear freeze are being duped by foreign ideas or agents? This affects the soapbox.
I think it does affect the soapbox, and I regret that the President made that statement. I myself am more in favor of freezing ice cubes than of a overall total freeze, which I think would create a lump of ice we couldn't handle. I think we need to go at the disarmament problem in a series of ice cubes. But that doesn't mean that people who support the freeze concept, some of them who think of it as a symbolic act rather than as something literally to be carried out, are in anything other than the most patriotic of American citizens. And I suspect that the President regrets that he hasn't told me so, mind you. I'm not claiming that. But I suspect that if he doesn't, Mike Deaver and Ed Meese regret that he said it.
Senator, I'm quite concerned about the large number of Americans who are really unaware of the Bill of Rights. In addition, there have been a number of polls that have shown when the rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights are expressed in very definitive terms, a large majority of Americans are opposed to the concepts that are embodied in the Bill of Rights. And I just wonder what you would suggest, from your experience, can be done to change that very dangerous trend in our country today.
Well, one very glib answer that comes to mind, but I hope not an unimportant one, is that we, of course, are approaching, in just about 4 years, the bicentennial of the writing of the Constitution, the framing of the Constitution. And these ceremonies, historic commemorations, ought to be more than just an occasion to get together for a party. They can be moments for some reflection on what the Constitution really means. And I would hope, and it might be a good project for the City Club, to think about some programs that would center on the value of the Bill of Rights as an integral part of the Constitution as we approach that bicentennial. More than that, of course, I think there is nothing like personal experience to teach people the value of the Constitution. I am always touched when I talk to American citizens who were born in other parts of the world and who have had experience with other kinds of government and who come to this country and feel the difference that the Bill of Rights makes in their lives. Not a theoretical difference, not something you read about in the history book, but the difference in their lives. And the testimony of these Americans is so strong that we must be sure that people who are indifferent hear it.
Senator, Mr. De Leon's question, and then a little addition, may I put a little more of an addition to it. Where is that line of demarcation between the individual who pays for all these mandates that comes down from above by taxation and his voice in these processes. It does seem that we ought to have a little bit more freedom, and I believe at one time you must have sat under Rufus Jones up at Haverford. We're restricted, and yet we pay the bill eventually. I mean, because we're taxpayers.
Well, the first answer that springs to mind is, of course, the ballot box. That's the primary tool to create some equality, some balance. But unfortunately, the American people are not using that tool. The high water mark of participation in elections in America was in the state of Michigan in 1896, when about 96% of the eligible voters actually turned out and voted. And since that time, it's been downhill all the way. And as you know, we now are lucky to muster 50% in a presidential election, and usually it's less than 50% in an off-year election. So that is one of the areas of real concern about the ability of people to maintain their liberties. They have the tool to do it, but if they won't use it, then God help us all.
Senator, on that question of imbalance, I wonder if you could comment on what appears to be an imbalance in access to media between either a public figure, such as our president, who has a different kind of access than most of the voters, or those who are able to pay for time. And I cite examples where words are used to obscure truth. And I think our president's statement recently on television, where he very selectively compared our defense capability, to my mind, was not the whole truth, yet he was elected by a democratic process.
I think we have to be concerned about access to the media, because the media plays such a vital role in our lives in modern America. And I don't think there is any doubt but that the development of electronic mass media has played a role in elevating the presidency to a position of visibility and of influence in this republic far beyond what the framers of the Constitution contemplated. And it's very hard to answer back to the president, because we only have one. And there really isn't anybody else who can say, well, I'm just as good as he is, and I'm going to say my piece. Members of Congress try it, but we tend to speak with 535 different tongues, and it doesn't come across with the same clarity as what a president has said, whether he's accurate or inaccurate. This is a troubling aspect of our modern society and our political life, and we're going to be examining that next month in the Senate Rules Committee when we hold some hearings on election laws, access to the media during an election period, whether or not as a condition to license, the broadcast media should do as in some European governments they do, require certain hours of broadcast time during a campaign, which is equally meted out to all candidates. Incidentally, helping us to get away from this outrageous expenditure of money, which is, I find, more and more shocking in campaigns. I was interested this year that in Maryland I observed some of the expense accounts of candidates for the state legislature who spent more, considerably more, to get elected than I spent when I ran for Congress the first time. And this is a form of escalation that I think is affecting access to the media. So I think this is one of the areas that we have to look at and see new ways to make sure that all citizens do have some right to be heard. Now, you can't equalize it totally. The public's always going to want to look at an attractive, articulate, informed person, or somebody who is perceived to be informed. And there isn't anything you can do about that. That's only God can change that. But we could give everybody a chance to stand up there under the light.
When you spoke about the San Diego conference and the restriction of information, weren't the scientists from the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc countries restricted as to what they could tell in their papers, and wouldn't the same thing be applied to us in that case?
Well, of course, we could apply restrictions simply by invoking the classification procedures. We could say to a scientist, your work is classified, and therefore you must hold it in confidence, subject to the normal classification procedures. And I don't think that I would be standing here raising an alarm if that had been the case. But in the San Diego situation, we were dealing with information in the public domain that had never been classified, that there had never been any cloak of secrecy cast over it. And that, it seems to me, is what is troubling.
Senator, this question also relates to classification of secret information. As I recall, in the 25 years following World War II, the criticism was that there was overclassification. Documents that should have been made public were not made public and were kept either secret or restricted for years and years for no good reason. Your example of the San Diego conference, again, would indicate that sort of the pendulum swung the other way, and they tend to declassify information perhaps sooner than they should. My question is there a middle ground in the classification area? Should there be a panel of disinterested citizens or some other method rather than having the classification procedure be handled by the issuers themselves?
I think the San Diego case, as I understand it, of course, did not involve information that would, under any circumstances, have been appropriately classified. It was, and that's what makes it so puzzling and so disturbing. If it had been material that, say, was improperly not classified and they were simply rectifying an earlier area, why, that would have been understandable. But because it was not security information in any sense, I find it difficult to justify the prior restraint on publication. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Senator Mathias. Thank you for coming. Our City Club Forum is adjourned.